right. Happy Friday, everybody. I hope you guys have been doing well. This is the Alteryx Server webinar series from Data Meaning. Just a quick recap from last time. My name is Stephen Morgan. I am the Professional Services Manager for the Data Meaning Enablement team. Data Meaning specifically, we are an end-to-end data solutions consulting group, and we are premier partners of Alteryx and very strong, heavy advocates for using Alteryx in many different ways to help build out more efficient, less overhead focused solutions to try to help people get a hold of their data, start using it appropriately, and not have all of the things that would normally burden them or kind of delay being able to make actionable decisions. Myself in particular, I specialize around some of that standardization, best practices, helping you get from that development standpoint to a proper production environment and set yourself up for future success and start implementing things like automation. I am a Server Connect partner and the Advanced Course certified, and have been working with Alteryx for a little over 7 years. And then I have over 13 years of experience in business intelligence, some of that business analytics, and I kind of come more from that IT systematic focus over into the world of analytics. So a lot of my emphasis is going to be on standardizing and getting things kind of structured and built out. Joining me is several members from the enablement team that's going to be keeping tabs on the Q&A to help address any questions or anything that comes up throughout the course of this webinar. And at the end, as always, I'm going to leave up a small bit of time for me to go over some of the different questions and things that may have came up. So as mentioned before, this is part 3 of our webinar series. So just a brief recap in the first portion here, I kind of covered a little bit of that overview of the Alteryx server. I then took it a step further and talked about how do you get an Alteryx server from that basic beginning standpoint to something more enterprise level. And today we're going to be focusing around how do you install the Alteryx server, how do you configure it, what are the configuration pieces, and some best practices in terms of backing up some of your stuff, setting things up for restorations, or just having an idea of where to find logs or any other means of addressing certain things that may come up as you are running your Alteryx environment. The remaining 2 sessions are going to focus more around the Alteryx gallery. And this is going to be a focus from the user side perspective. So taking in a lot of that user experience. And then we're going to end it with a discussion about the administrative side. Some of the information that I'm going to be covering today is going to kind of touch a bit on that admin side that we'll cover at the end webinar. And it's also going to touch back on some of the stuff we covered in the previous 2 sessions. So, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump straight in. So session 3, that server installation, the deployment, and a bit about the agenda here. So that first piece, we're going to talk in detail about the installation, how to get the Alteryx server, and some things to be mindful of. And then we're going to go deep into the details about your configurations and how you set up each piece that builds and makes up that Alteryx server environment. Then lastly, we're going to go over some supplemental things, like I had mentioned, the backup and restoration, how to start looking through your logs, what are some limitations you can put to your environment to get better usage out of it or to make sure you're not overwhelming it. And then lastly, the Q&A. So moving a bit forward, let's go straight into the installation overview. So first things first, before you could do anything with the installation, you have to actually have the package so that you can install it on your local server machine. Now you can find the server download from the downloads.alteryx.com. It will ask you to log in on the Alteryx site, which my understanding is the licensing and such is tied to the end portion of your email. That way they know which company you are representing, and if you do have the appropriate permissions and whatnot, you will be able to access certain products that are available in the downloads. But you will need to make sure you have a valid license in order to download a particular product. That having been said, it does not necessarily mean you have to use your license then and there. This is purely just making sure that if you are getting Alteryx Server and you're going to download it, you need to make sure that your account is essentially flagged for the means to do so. Now, when you go to the downloads page, you're going to see a list of all the different products. In our particular case here, we're talking the Alteryx Server. So you simply can click on that, and you're going to see a listing of the newest version as well as a tab for previous versions. And when you select into this, it's going to take you to the files themselves. In the examples that we're going to be covering today and moving forward through the webinars, we're going to be using the 2019.4 because that is what we use in-house currently within Data Meaning. As mentioned in our first webinar, we tend to stay one version behind so that we have fully vetted it, tested it, and can recommend it confidently to any client as we start doing implementation. Alteryx is constantly evolving. It is continuously building new versions and new components within it. And as just part of the nature of the beast when it comes to development, sometimes the more recent versions, they need to come up with hot fixes, and we want to give them that buffer time as well as to be able to vet it ourselves personally before we would extend that over to a client installation. So that is more of our internal best practice, just to make sure that, hey, we can certify this ourselves because we run off of the same version. So when you select a particular version, you're going to see two different files here, but the one that we're most concerned about is that first one, the Alteryx Server piece. As you can see, it's got a decent size, it's a little under a gig, and you have your installation package here. The installation itself is actually very self-explanatory. Just like most Windows-based packages, you simply run it and it will take care of the rest, prompt you as to where you want to save the server files and go from there. So some caveats to note. First off, you need to make sure that you are either a local administrator or higher in your environment in order to install the server. We do recommend that you save the server to a separate drive from your local operating system. And this is very important when you start looking at backups and imaging and different options to kind of get a little bit more standard practices for that fail-safe and that restoration. Now, when you do the server installation, you are prompted an option to install the predictive analytics package within the server. The big thing to note here, though, is even though you can select this and it will install that, it will not build in and import in any of the libraries. So if you are using custom Python libraries or R, you need to make sure that as part of your Q&A, as part of getting your server operational, you need to make sure you import these at least once into your environment so that they are there. What's done with the predictive analytics is opening up the means to do this. Taking it a step further is how you make sure that all of these are intact and good to go. So once you have gotten through the install, like I said, it's a very simple, straightforward process. The next thing that you're going to be prompted with is getting things set up. So what you would want to do is navigate to something called System Settings. And that is going to be a program that is on the desktop of the server itself once you have completed your installation. Once more, you need to make sure you are a local admin or higher. And what it will do when you open this up is it will list out the existing status of your server environment. Now, when I'm doing the walkthrough here, our environment is already stood up. you may see the controller, worker, and gallery listed as disabled. That's perfectly fine if that is the first time you've opened it up, because what the next steps are going to entail is how do you set this up and where do you go from there. So kind of moving on in, we're going to jump into that environment configuration. So within this, the first thing right out the gate that they ask you is what type of setup are you going to be implementing? You have the option to do a designer only, which normally is a very uncommon thing, but in a situation where you're going to have multiple people kind of remoting in and building a workflow, it is an option. I have very rarely seen this. The same also sort of applies for that designer and scheduler only piece. In most cases, if you are already at this stage where you have the server installed and you're starting to do the configurations, you're likely already past needing just designer or just a designer with the scheduling module. Instead, you are going to be looking at some of these down here. The first, a complete Alteryx server piece. And this installs everything. That is making sure that you have your controller, your worker, your gallery, your internal database. Every component that we covered in the previous sections are going to be tied in this complete package. You do, however, have the select custom, and you can enable and disable pieces of the Alteryx server environment as you see fit. For example, if you were wanting to build out a worker node, what you can do is simply go to custom, hit enable worker. You don't need the controller, you don't need the gallery, and what it will then ask you to do is just make sure you have a controller key by which this worker can connect to. And at that point, you're using the resources of this machine, then working in conjunction with the bigger server platform that you have on a different system. So the first area, once you've selected what you are trying to set up, this is going to ask you for a location for your global workspace. Now, the big thing to keep in mind here, this is the root directory for the Alteryx server, and any underlying files, logs, or temporary areas by which a workflow or other processes kind of take place. This is something to be very mindful of, because you want to make sure that whatever account is going to be running and utilizing the Alteryx server in the backend, that it has access to this location. Because if it does not, you are going to start seeing errors and disconnects occur on a regular basis, and you don't want to run into that. So not much to really say here beyond this is where you designate your root folder for the Alteryx platform. So moving a little bit further, we're going to jump into some of these controller configurations. Now, this is when we start getting into some deeper details here. So the first piece here in this general segment, we have our controller token. I had mentioned this previously before, where you can select view to see what this token is, or in a very bad situation, hit regenerate if you do need to recreate a token. But the important thing here, especially if you are building out workers or you're starting to expand your environment, this controller token is what connects every other piece of the Alteryx environment together. So you want to make sure that if you do need this, go to view, then use that within a particular worker node that you're setting up. You are able to designate a workspace by which the controller is going to be bringing in stuff and operating and doing its processes. And this is normally used for prepping something to display within a gallery. For example, if a user requests something and it needs to queue it up, it may go through this workspace first prior to sending it to that user. The bigger important piece of the configuration for a controller is the logging area. So once more, you're designating a location by which your logs are going to be stored, but now we're going to get into something a little bit more important here. First off, you have the ability to set the level of detail. Now, I don't know about you guys, and I don't know how deep you've been involved with some of the QA and some of the different processes to try to keep tabs on your environment. I highly recommend that if you have the bandwidth and you have the means to store some heavier duty files, set this to high, because it will tell you in great detail everything that is taking place on the Alteryx server, what is being queued up, what is being ran, did it hit an issue, any amount of detail will be stored within the high context. If you set this up to low, for example, then you are not going to get that full detail. So again, gauge it based on how much space you have and how bloated this may become, because you can designate a maximum file size, and I'll touch on this more when we go into logging at the end. But I've always erred on the side of having more information is better than not having enough. But you will want to start taking into consideration that file size and how you are going to archive and try to consolidate some of this information. And I'll touch on that a bit. The next piece here is that scheduler. So by default, scheduler can be a separate component altogether for the Alteryx environment. But the important thing to be mindful of here is the controller is designed to collaborate with the database, with the scheduler, in order to run and routinely have workflows take place. So having that checked is normally a default. I would make sure that is checked just so if you don't have a complicated connection for your environment, you want to make sure that controller and scheduler are able to communicate immediately. That way you can feel confident that what gets scheduled will run and you won't have to worry about any other issues that come from it. The last is the ability to enable insights. So what insights are is a semi-visualization tool within the Alteryx gallery. And you're basically creating data visualizations and exposing them within that Alteryx gallery. So depending on the use case and depending on the circumstances, you may have a need to display something to end users, or perhaps people within the same team working on particular workflows. The advantage of this is they can go within the gallery, the same area where they're looking at their workflows and everything else, and see some of these visualizations. Now, I'll touch on this a lot more in the next 2 sessions, but there are some benefits to using the insights, and just having it enabled is not going to harm your performance on your system. Now, in terms of the usage and development of insights, that may lead to something different. As they start building these up, it does still take resources to expose and create these visualizations that people would be interacting with. So moving on a little bit, we're going to jump into the persistence layer. And this is a terminology essentially for the database component of your Alteryx server. So it is tied very heavily to the controller, but as we mentioned before, it is a standalone component. It is that database solidarity that you're going to be using. So the first area is that ability to select database type. By default, it is going to have that MongoDB. And when it mentions MongoDB here, it is referring to the internal MongoDB that exists on the server platform. Now, if you were starting to consider things like building out a replica set, starting to do sharding, or starting to expand your environment, you will need to move from MongoDB to that user-managed MongoDB, which means you will now have to designate a whole separate location and other components that are tied to that database environment. And I'll touch on this in a moment. So firstly, when you are accessing a database environment, you need to make sure you have this pointed, this data folder, to the database files that you're going to be leveraging. Simple enough. Now, if you are using, you will also need to provide that host database name, the username, and the password connections to the MongoDB environment. Without this, you have no database, which means you have no skeletal structure for the rest of your server. And this is a very important piece to be mindful of. Lastly, the persistence options. And I'm going to touch on this more when I'm talking about how you can clean up and adjust some of the stuff on your database environment. But the big thing to keep in mind is you do have some options to help clean things up and consolidate a little. So moving along, we're going to jump into mapping. And essentially what mapping is that allows the controller to utilize some of its resources to provide rendered map tiles to people that will be using spatial data or will be using things that are related to that map input tool within the Alteryx platform. Now, the first major things to keep in mind is you can store up any number of caching for tiles, and you want to be mindful of that each tile is just a little under half a megabyte in terms of RAM that is being used on the machine. So obviously the more tiles that you are caching, the more RAM that's going to be impacted. Now you can also store some of this as referential data by putting in a disk cache. And this is essentially your hard drive space that you are using to store the maximum size of a particular map tile. Lastly, the reference layer time to live. And this is very important if you are working with a lot of spatial data and you are starting to build out multiple map tiles and multiple workflows, or multiple users are going to be referencing them very often. There's no sense in bogging down your system and having it redo the same process over and over and over again in such a short amount of time. So by setting up this time to live, you're essentially storing and stabilizing a lot of this information so that rather than redo the process, it's just going to go and reference that data and bring it back out. So this is a very useful tool to leverage in the event that you need to constantly be sharing your map tiles. There's no sense in bogging down your system. So this helps significantly for performance. So that kind of covers what is taking place within the controller. Now we're going to move a little bit further in and start talking about the worker node and the underlying pieces that kind of make up how the worker associates with the environment. So next step, that worker configuration. And the first things right off the bat that I want to point out is, yes, just like everything else, you are then designating a workspace for the operations of that particular workflow. So when that worker node goes and grabs a workflow and says, hey, I'm going to start running this and I'm going to start detailing this is going to begin within that workspace area. The next segments here are all going to be tied to a little bit of that fine tuning. So if you remember when I talked about scaling in our last session, you can keep putting multiple engines within your Alteryx worker. But the more and more you add, the more and more they're going to compete for resources. By default, in terms of a reference, you only want to have as many workflows able to run simultaneously as half the amount of cores on that particular worker node. Now, keep in mind that the server itself, if you have just a standalone singular node server, it is treating itself as a worker node. So keep that in mind. But the idea is if you have, for example, 4 cores on your machine, you should be able to confidently say, I want to run 2 workflows simultaneously. So 2 cores for 1 workflow. The other thing to remember is, again, 1 workflow is equal to 1 engine. You can have multiple engines on a worker node, but the more you add, the more bogged down your environment becomes. The next little area here, the ability to cancel jobs that are running longer than a certain amount of time. This is important if you have not done a lot of benchmarking to your workflows. Not every workflow is going to run the same way or be equal in terms of what it's trying to do. You might have some workflows that take 5 or 10 seconds to run, but you might have others that are hitting very large sources of data, and they need to do joins and they need to do all of these complex calculations. And that's going to take a lot of time to process. So as part of your own benchmarking, you want to get an understanding for how long should the maximum amount of time of any workflow run. And you want to set your cancellation for a little bit higher than that just to be safe, and let it help curb things in the event of a workflow that may be hanging. Let's say it's trying to connect to something and for whatever reason the system is blocking that connection. Well, in some cases it'll error out and cancel the workflow for you anyway. But in the event that it doesn't, you need something that will close that connection, and you need something that will stop having this workflow continuously try churning and using up your resources. So this is a way that you can protect yourself and kind of get a little bit better control. And I'm going to touch on this a bit more later on. The quality of service piece here is referencing a little bit more around the usage of a multi-node environment. And this is where you can kind of set your priority list in a way. So by using quality of service, you can designate certain worker nodes to pick up the slack, and then in a bad situation, it can be escalated to something else. And this also kind of ties into that job assignment piece. Now, in the next 2 sessions, I'm going to be talking a lot about job tags and just tagging workflows in general. But the idea with this is you can specify what job tags are going to be associated to a workflow, so that, let's say, instead of having what I have listed here, let's say you have data science. So the workflow you are running is a data science specific workflow. Well, you could have worker nodes dedicated to just running data science. So you would have this unchecked. So anything that's unassigned cannot go to this worker node. And you are only going to run anything that is a data science worker or a data science tag. So this is a great way that you can start dividing up your resources and leveraging them in a way that's a little bit more effective for your particular environment. So certainly a lot to unpack there, but this is where you can do a lot of that heavier customization around your worker nodes. The next area, kind of talking about this run as. So we've already talked about your configuration of the workers. Now let's talk about that default user that you want to run your workflows as. Now, the reason why this is important is if this is left unchecked, it is going to use whatever the service is running as, whether that's a service account or some other admin account set up. If you specify a user here, that means any workflow ran on the server is going to use the credentials provided here to try and run and access any location. Keep in mind, there are ways to change that even at a workflow level, and I'll touch on that a lot more in the next 2 sessions. The next area is that mapping configuration. So again, tied back to the controller, where you are caching and storing some mapping, this is kind of that extra step. You can enable a worker node to actually use some of its resources to help build and create map tiles. So again, the more you increase, the better performance with your map tiles, but you are going to start using up more and more of your worker node's resources. And this kind of follows suit with that next piece talking about insights. So again, there's no harm in directly enabling an insights to be able to be processed by a worker node, but you still want to be mindful of what the insights are being built for, what they're being used. You can set how many insights you want to allow to be created simultaneously. You can set up caching, and since the insights are exposed to the Alteryx gallery, you can also load those into third-party environments. For example, if you have SharePoint, you can embed insights by connecting up to a particular location and having a port connection opened, dedicated to that insight. So there's a lot of different things that you can do here to get a little bit more functionality. So now that we've covered that controller and the worker piece, we're going to start moving a little bit more on the user-centric side. And this is the gallery configurations. Right off the bat, just like before, we have a general tab that's going to talk about the workspace and where we're going to hold any of the jobs or operations that take place with the gallery. The other thing of big note is the logging directory. So in this area, we're going to store any logs of anything that takes place in the gallery. And these store some comprehensive information. You can see when a person logs in, when they queue up a particular workflow, or even what accounts these workflows are being ran as. The next little area is you can specify a base address, and if need be, you can enable an SSL for that. So this is good for setting up your intranet to have your own customized website for the Alteryx gallery and have it exposed only to internal users that can access this location. Lastly, we can set a default run mode. Now, there are some settings and configuration on the server or on the Alteryx gallery side that allow you to tweak this further. So I'm not going to touch on this too much, but I just wanted to let you know that you can set a baseline here in the system settings before you even go into the gallery admin side. The next big piece is the gallery authentication. And this is something you need to take into consideration when you are first standing up your server environment. Selecting an authentication type and providing the associated information. So in the case of SAML, making sure you have your IDP data, having any configuration if you happen to be going to a particular URL and using the 509 certificate. You need to make sure all of that is available prior to this so that you can get it set up cleanly at once. The major thing I want to caution here, and I have it down here in red, you do not want to change your authentication type after you have installed and initially set up your server environment. It can be done. You can change it. However, it will cause a lot of technical issues on your MongoDB server environment. What you would have to do at that stage is go through a reinstallation process, do some restorations of your files. It is a mess, and it is something that every now and then we get brought in to help a client in a situation like that. It never ends very cleanly. It is normally a lengthy process to get it back up and up to the state it was prior to changing the authentication type. So please keep that in mind when you are setting up your server for the first time. You want to make sure you know your authentication type from the get-go. The last bit here is setting up that default gallery administrator. And what you would want to do with this, set either a very strong subject matter expert or an IT person to be that default administrator. You can use a service account. I have seen it done, but generally this account is what needs to be logged in and used to set up the initial bit of your admin configurations. So in this particular case, what you set as your default admin here, they're responsible for going in and making everybody else a curator, for setting those initial permissions. Once you've done that, you don't need to log in as this administrator anymore, because the curators can take over and do what needs to be done to the environment. But it is still important to keep in mind what this account is and how to access it. One other thing that I would like to caution here is if you go in and remove the account from the Alteryx gallery side, you will not have your super admin permissions anymore. So you would have to go back in here and put it back in. So just be mindful of that. I've seen people accidentally lock themselves out of their own server environment by playing around with this and the gallery admin side. The next area that we're going to talk to is that SMTP settings. Now, the first thing I want to bring up as a caveat is this is not tied to the workflows themselves sending out an email. That is specified within the email tool itself, and you can use that to send an email to however many users or any particular case. This is more for messaging that comes from the server side. And generally, once you have this set up, you're good to go. You can test it, make sure the connection's good, and move forward. So I'm not going to touch on this too much. Lastly, within the gallery side, we're going to talk about the persistence. And my recommendation is, unless you have separate Mongo databases set up for particular components of your Alteryx environment, which is normally not very common unless you have very specific levels of sharding, it's better to leave these checked and tell the gallery to reference whatever the controller is using for its persistence layer. That way you have some consistency and you can standardize on it. It's easier to do backups in one location than it is multiple. So now we're going to move into the last component, which is the engine configuration. Now the engine, as mentioned in the previous sessions, is that workhorse. It is what is building and running your workflows. So once more, we got a temporary location where it is running and processing. We have a logging directory, which I'll touch on that shortly. And we have the package staging directory. And this is dedicated for building out packages before it sends it to the end user. Then lastly, you have some configurations that you can do here to limit some of the size and some of what's there. And these last two here I want to touch on. Again, by default, if you're running a single node environment, you are running your gallery and your workflows and engines on the same machine. So you will want to have this checked because you do not want to interrupt the user experience just so workflows can run slightly faster. It does bog things down. It does make things a little bit more hairy. So by checking this, the workflows will still process, but you don't impact the user experience. When you start expanding out your environment, you don't need to worry about that as much. The alias just allows a user to define certain areas they're pointing to, and you can reference that as opposed to what gets set up in the system. And lastly, you have the proxy configuration. This is fairly new to the Alteryx server environment, and it by default is set up to auto-detect the system information as to whether or not a proxy is being used, and it provides the stuff here. You can include a username, password, credentials as needed. And then the last little bit here, once you've went through each part of the settings, it's going to ask you to finalize. Now, the important thing to note with this is when you select finish here, it will save any adjustments that you have made throughout the entirety of this configuration, and it will restart the Alteryx service. What that means is it will take your server and gallery offline for a few minutes while it is restarting the service. So be very mindful of this when you make a change. So lastly, we're going to move into some of these Alteryx system components. And just to make sure that we have enough time to get to some Q&A, I'm going to go through this a little bit quick, but if you do need any additional information or you are curious about some of this, please feel free to reach out to myself or any member of our data meaning team. And you can also reach out to our sales team and they will get somebody to help you that is able to focus on that particular topic or that particular question that you might have. So the first little bit is the Alteryx services. In the services segment of the server, you have what is called Alteryx service. This is normally automatically loaded anytime you start up the server, and this is that cornerstone, that service layer that I spoke of in the previous sessions for your environment. Without this, you do not have a server up. So making sure that that's up and running is that first step. But some things you want to be mindful of is, first off, what account is it logging in as? If you do not have something specified on the system settings for a particular account to be that default to run your workflows, it is going to use what you specify here, whether that is the local system account that set up the service in the first place, or a service account you may have specified here. The next piece is talking about recovery. So for recovery, you want to make sure that you have something set up around your failures. So you want to at least have the first and second failure try to restart the service. After all, in production environments, you need to get your server back up. Beyond that, you don't want to keep hammering your system, but you might want to start considering setting up maybe a batch script or something else to start sending off notifications. Some people use third-party software to help monitor system environments. This might be a particularly good use case for that. The next thing I'm going to touch on is how to back up the MongoDB. So first things first, you want to open command prompt and run as an administrator. This is very important. From there, you can enter in command lines such as this, where you will stop the service, perform your backup, and then start the service back up. Now again, this takes the server down for a few moments, but it is a very clean, quick way to get that database back up. The restoration is actually the same exact thing. You go back into command prompt as an admin, you stop the service, you run the emongo restore, pointing to a location to put in any logs, and you are pointing to the location of your backup. And once more, start the service. There are other ways to do a restoration, but this is the most concrete way to do it, save for using other programs or other resources. Now, kind of circling back a bit about that cleanup piece. So when I mentioned that persistence layer and how I was talking about these settings, your database is eventually going to get large. And as you have more workflows and more things getting queued and ran, you need a means to start shrinking that. So by using these persistence options, you can say, okay, after the results have been displayed for 120 days, I don't need to show this anymore. I can go ahead and remove this. You can do the same for any files that get uploaded or shared with particular users. The big thing to note with this is you want to find a good balance between storing enough information for referencing, but also use your backups and use other means to archive and reference and start thinking from a systematic perspective. How do you get the resource usage down while still keeping as much information as possible? So, some food for thought. The next little bit here is talking about logging. Now, by default, if you've set up your program data Alteryx file, you're going to have some of the logs being stored in these particular folders. And some of what you'll see in this next bit is an example of some of these logs stored by the controller. We had 10 megabytes listed as our file size. So every time it hits that cap, it creates a new one, and it is writing in any relevant information for what took place in that controller. Another thing that I'm going to show is the engine's logs. So by going into this, to give you an example of what this looks like, you can see that this log is dedicated to one instance of running a particular workflow. It tells you each of the tools, what ran. It tells you every single step of the workflow, what it did, what it was trying to accomplish, and you can follow it all the way down. Now, in terms of error handling, you can read these logs and you can start leveraging some stuff for visualization. I'm not going to touch too deep into that, but it is a valuable resource. Between the logs and the MongoDB, you can find anything in your system environment. The next thing I'm going to touch is some runtime limitations. So again, I mentioned any hanging jobs or jobs that take too long, you can use a timeout for this and have them cancel. You can also set workers to run simultaneously. Again, keep in mind, the more you're running on a particular worker, the more bogged down it becomes, the more competed for resources it becomes. And the engine side, you have the means to limit how much memory gets allocated to a browse tool. You can limit how much resources are dedicated to joins, which are normally the most intensive component of your workflows. You can set amounts of processing threads if you're doing multi-threading, and you can specify whether or not you want a user to be able to actually change this. So it's a very nice piece for helping you get things under a little bit of control and starting a little bit of benchmarking. And lastly, I wanted to touch on automated backups. And I'm not going to go into full detail on this. However, again, if you do want to learn a little bit more information and you do want to figure out what are some different options, please feel free to reach out to myself, to any member of our team and our sales group, and we will get answers for you and we will help you in this. Some of these get a little bit more involved than others depending on how deep you want to take this. So for automating your backups, first off, you can build an Alteryx workflow and schedule it to do it. You can set up command line inside the Alteryx environment. So that stop or that start, stop, and push, you can do that by taking a little bit of leverage and saying, okay, I'm going to tell this workflow to run this batch script. And by the virtue of the batch script, it is disabling the server. But because you're now running the batch script instead, it's going to continue running and start the service back up. So it's a very interesting way of doing it, but I've seen it done successfully. And it does help keep things a little bit more consolidated. Some of the other methods is you can build your own batch scripts and schedule them through Run Task on the Task Manager. You can use third-party software to set up batch scripts or command lines. And one very common thing I've seen is people just simply snapshot and image the server. All of these methods work and are perfectly viable. I do recommend that if you are doing an upgrade, you want to make sure that you are taking a copy of the MongoDB prior to it, regardless of what you've done in terms of imaging. But it is a viable option in terms of everyday operation. The recommended cadence is a little bit more self-explanatory. If you are working with a production environment, I recommend set something up nightly to take a backup, just to be safe. In the event of a staging, sandbox, or development environment, you can set it to daily if you need to, but you can go to weekly. There's no harm in that because, again, it's not supposed to be a production environment. You don't necessarily need to check it constantly. And then the big thing with this is find what works best for your environment and best for your processes and build a solution based on that. So in our next session, we're going to jump into the user side of the Alteryx gallery and then finish up in the following section with the admin side. So a lot of what we've covered in these first 3 sessions, you're going to see bits and pieces of it being referenced because we've kind of front loaded all of that structure, and now you're going to see why it is beneficial. So that sums up what we're going to cover today. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask now, but you can also reach out to our sales team, to myself, to any member of the enablement team. We're more than happy to help. So I'm going to go ahead and check some of the QA here. So, will a multi-node environment setup be covered as part of these sessions? I covered that a bit in the previous session, and that is focused a bit more around just giving an example of what you can connect up in certain pieces that make up what a multi-node environment is. As far as how to directly set one up piece by piece, that I'm not going to be covering in these sessions. So I hope that kind of answers it a little bit. Then this bit here, can we use an Active Directory group as an administrator in settings? That's a good question. So technically, yes, you can. However, be mindful of when you are setting your default admin, because I have seen issues where if you set a group as it, it has conflicting permissions between the users of that group. So in this example, I would say you might be better off using a service account as your default system admin, but then you can use Active Directory groups to set your permissions within the environment. So for example, what I've seen certain groups do is they may have groups broken out by department, but they might have it broken out by roles as well. So they will set an Active Directory group as a curator group. And then in the Alteryx server, the gallery admin piece, they will then give them the permissions and the means to be curators. So you have your service account that's setting those initial permissions, and then anybody that's part of like an IT admin group are already admins by virtue of their Active Directory group. And that's kind of how they operate. So you can do it. I would just caution to make sure that you're doing it in the right way so that you don't have access or any type of permissions competing against each other. So any other questions? I know there's a lot of things going on in chat. So let me scroll back through here, but please feel free to add in any questions as you see fit. So, yes. So talking about versioning, when you are working with the server and the designer, you want to make sure that they are using the same version. That gets very tricky when you start going between the client or the designer side and the server. If you have a sandbox environment and you start upgrading and building upon it, then you want to make sure that you have a means to access your original server on the correct version. Else you're going to start running into some issues such as not being able to publish or run a workflow between your versions. And I just saw this kind of come in. If you haven't received an email from Data Meaning, I will double check on this. I do believe we have a list of everyone that has attended, and I will make sure that we're getting emails out. I know on the first session, we committed to making sure that you would have that one-page pre-install quick start for the server. So we want to make sure that we get that out to you. But also in addition to that, you can always reach out to myself, stephen.morgan@datameaning.com, or you can reach out to our sales group here at this email, and they will get you in touch with myself or somebody that is part of our enablement team. That way we can kind of help. All right. How to deal with the password change in Alteryx Server. Schedule on the server. Okay, so that one can be a little bit tricky. And it depends on how you are setting up your connections. So let's use Salesforce as an example. When you are setting up Salesforce and that connection to bring in the data, what you are going to do is, rather than just build that as part of the tool and write in this account, this password, and all of the stuff there, you want to create what is called dynamic connections. And this is a little bit more of an involved topic, but what you would essentially do is you would have some referential information, whether that is stored in a secure YXDB, or if that is in some sort of area that you can pull from as referential information. And what it's going to do is it will find that Salesforce connection, replace it with the information stored in that location, and then continue on. So if you have an area that is storing some of this connection information, you can keep that secure and locked up and just have the Alteryx workflow reference it, bring back what it needs because it found a match, replace your password and your username, whatever may take place, and continue on the rest of your workflow. So it's a little involved, but it is a good way to set up something so that as your passwords change, as your access changes, it has a means to kind of reconcile itself. All right, so we got time to answer one more. I see Robert had mentioned about the multiple versions. And as far as the server 2020.1, so as Robert put here, we spend time evaluating and kind of deep diving into any server implementation. And before we recommend it for any client, we ourselves have to be on that version. We make that part of our standards and practices. With that being said, I know there have been a lot of hot fixes and a lot of good things coming out of 2020.1. For us internally, we are still operating off of 2019.4, and we push that for any installation on the client side. That being said, as the new version starts rolling around and as 2020.2 comes out or is about to come out, we're going to then make that jump and start pushing for 2020.1. And it's just our own personal best practice to always kind of vet everything and stay a little bit behind the new versions coming out so that the new development can take place. But again, we're trying to make sure that we're 100% confident beyond a shadow of a doubt that the version lines up appropriately and does not run into issues on a production environment. And this is of no ill will towards Alteryx. I know that they're developing a lot of great things very quickly. This is just our way of helping promote the product, but at the same time, make sure that they're not going to get service calls about something that may have happened that, you know, could just be a one-off situation in the middle of the night. So again, trying to make it as less stressful for everybody involved as possible. So we vet particular versions, keep them into our environment, and once we're confident and good using it, we then recommend it to a client. So I think that about covers our time. It's just slightly over, but I wanted to thank everybody for taking the time to attend this session. And again, please reach out to me, to any member of the enablement team or our sales team located here, and we will help address any questions or anything that comes up. And I hope you guys have a good weekend, and looking forward to meeting with you guys next week.